Many times when I drive through Stallman Farms, I see cars parked alongside the road and people taking pictures amongst the tunnel of trees. I often wonder how many of them know the history, the stories, the legacy of many humble people who lived and worked here. Hello, everybody. My name is Blanca Araujo. I am a professor in the College of Health, Education, and Social Transformation here at New Mexico State University. I am also one of the very lucky people who had the privilege of growing up in Stallman Farms. My father, Jorge, rest in peace, worked in Stallman for 44 years. He was a mayordomo in the sorteadora, the pecan sorter. And my family lived in Esperanza first. We started there, and then we moved to Plaza. There were two of the ranchos that were scattered around the farm and served as a housing for the workers and their families. I lived in Stallman all my childhood. And Stallman was a wonderful place to live, as you saw through the documentary. All of the kids would spend much time outside under the trees, riding our bikes, playing kickball, baseball, soccer, and even building tree houses. Stallman was a place where people got married. A lot of people got married in Stallman, had babies, some were born there, people died there, and for many of us, Stallman helped shape who we are today. And although it sounds cliche-ish, everyone knew everybody, and everybody would take care of each other. This was evident one day when me and my sister got in trouble because we crossed the street. I don't know why we crossed the street. My father always prohibited us from crossing the street, and then one day we just decided to be sneaky and cross the street. So when my dad got home that night, the first time we heard was, "Why were you crossing the streets, mijas?" Somebody had told on us. But it was a good thing because they were taking care of us. Some of my fondest memories are of the Stallman yearly barbacoa. And this was a big company fiesta, and it was for the workers, and it was after the pecan harvest was over. The barbacoa took place in the Stallman Airport, up on the mesa, and lots of planning took place. And from listening to the oral history project, I learned that my father was instrumental in fabricating a huge barbecue grill and pit that was below ground, in which they would cook almost 2,000 pounds of beef for the big party. They would drop the beef with a winch in the hole. They would cover it and leave it there all night and then bring it out the next day. The beef was soft and tender, and there was tons of beef for everybody that attended. The women would help cook, like Mrs. Ceniceros, who we collected stories from. She told us that she cooked the rice. Other ladies cooked the beans, bread, salsa, tortillas. Cruz Mesa would bring mariachis, and there was even karaoke in which Mr. Stallman would participate at times. There was a lot of beer for the adults, a lot of beer, and ice cream for the kids. There was always a line of cars to get to the barbacoas. The barbacoas are one of my best memories of Stallman. I remember everybody together and everybody celebrating the end of the harvest. There are many similar stories that I heard in the oral history project that I will share a little bit about now. And this started in 2016. A group of professors, Dr. Rodolfo Chavez Chavez, Judith Flores Carmona, and myself, began a project of collecting the oral histories of the people who lived and worked in Stallman Farms. We collected the stories from 13 people and families, and unfortunately, around half of these people, or maybe even a little bit more, have already passed away. Employees who lived in the company ranchos had many stories to share. They talked about what it was like to live in the farm, about the treatment they received from the owners, stories of what it was like working in Stallman, about raising children in the farm, and about the long impact this life and upbringing has had on at least 3 or 4 generations of Southern New Mexicans. It truly was a privilege to listen to the stories. And while I would like to share a lot of stories, I will only share a few with you today. The first one I'm going to share is, I call it La Llorona. And it's about me and my friend Lupe. My friend Lupita, we were riding our bikes one day like we always did. We were always out riding our bikes through the trees on the dirt roads. And we were just hanging out talking, and we happened to look over through the trees. And we saw a lady in a long flowing gown walking through the trees. And we both looked at each other and we screamed. We dropped our bikes I still don't know why we dropped the bikes. I think it would have been quicker to ride the bikes. We dropped them and we ran. We ran to our house. And ever since then, I firmly believed that I had seen La Llorona, which I had heard many stories about as a kid. So fast forward 40 years later, when I'm collecting the stories, I'm sitting around the kitchen table listening to the Ortiz family, and they were telling me stories about people that lived in Stamen. And they shared that they knew of this lady who used to like to drink. And she would get drunk, and she would like to walk amongst the trees in her long flowing gown. So when I heard this story, I was like, oh my goodness, that's my Llorona right there. It was not La Llorona, it was a lady from Stamen who liked to drink. So this, needless to say, I need to tell my friend Lupita, I need to find her and tell her, because she probably still thinks that La Llorona exists. I like to tell this story because it reminds me of how awesome it was to be a kid in Stamen. And I heard many stories of the people I interviewed about bike riding through the pecan trees. Miss Pavia shared that she would meet her friends halfway between the trees, between ranchos. They also shared stories about many parties in Stamen. Many people had weddings, quinceañeras, baby showers, all under the trees. They talked about the matachines who would dance from rancho to rancho for Our Lady of Guadalupe Day. And then I also remember that they had a Catholic Mass in the old planta in Plaza, and they also had catechism in Plaza. So they took a priest from San Miguel, and he would have the Mass and the catechism. My next story I call Hey, and this one comes from Mr. Solis. And he explained to me how Mr. Stamen had helped a lot of people buy their own homes. And you can still find a lot of these homes in the communities of El Alto de las Flores, which is close to San Miguel, and in Del Cerro, which you can see as you're riding to El Paso on Alpha Highway I-10. And so Mr. Solis recounted that he wanted to build his own home, but he wanted to build it from the ground up, and the bank would not loan him the money unless his house was already built. So he thought of going to Stamen, which was now being run by one of the Stamen daughters, and he wanted to ask her for help. So he went and asked Miss Stamen for $57,000 so he could build his house. She looked at him, she thought about it, and she said, wow, we've never lent so much money before. So Mr. Solis knew that she liked Julio Iglesias a lot. So he offered her, he made an offer. He said, I'll pay you $100,000 extra in interest, and I'll sing you a Julio Iglesias song. So she just looked at him and said, let me think about that. So he left. He didn't hear from her. 5 days later, she calls him, and she asked him to go to the office. So he walks into the office, and she tells him, start singing. So he smiled. Does that mean you're gonna lend me the money? Start singing and we can talk later. So he sang the song Hey by Julio Iglesias. He got the money, he sang the song, and he built his home. And then he was able to repay the loan with the $1,000 extra in due time. And then I asked him, so did you sign a contract? And he said, oh no, back then all we did was a handshake and a Julio Iglesias song. And that's the way it was. That's the way it was back then in Stamen. There were no contracts, you were trusted by your word. Several participants shared that when they needed a car, they would tell Mr. Stamen, and he would tell them, get in the car, let's go to Cruces and choose which car you wanted. So they would always do that. And Mr. Stamen would buy the car in cash, and the worker would take his car home, and they would take the money out of his paycheck. But the worker wouldn't have to pay interest. So it worked for both, right? So when I shared this with my mom, she told me that we too had benefited from that, and that my dad had bought a Ford Mercury using this honor system. And I never knew this story until I started listening to the stories from the people. I also heard stories about working with the thousands of geese that once existed in Stamen and that served to eat the weeds. Mr. Armendariz shared how he had to place the geese eggs in the incubator, and they would check to see if the eggs had a baby inside, a baby gosling. And they would use a light to check the egg. So they would use the light, and if the egg had a little spot on it, that meant that the egg had a baby gosling. If the egg looked clear, then there was no baby. So the eggs that had the baby were moved to a smaller incubator until the goslings were born. Sometimes the goslings could not emerge from their shell, so Mr. Armendariz had to crack the egg and help the babies come out. And he shared that he would go home and tell his mom that he never wanted to eat eggs for breakfast ever again. The Bevel sisters shared how they lived next to the Stamens, so they benefited from hand-me-down clothes from the Stamen daughters. And Doris shared that they once got a petticoat that had been bought in New York from the daughters, and they said that all the sisters loved it. They all wore it even as a skirt, and they wore it until it was pieces. Miss Chabelita Uribe, who was 104 years old when we interviewed her, told us about her husband who would deliver fresh milk to all the ranchos every day, every home. He was a Stamen milkman. And then we have Mr. Gonzalez, who bought around 30 acres of land and planted his own pecan trees. And he had a university professor who would send him agriculture students to learn from him and his land. And he was so knowledgeable about the land that the university professor would constantly ask Mr. Gonzalez, which university did you attend? And Mr. Gonzalez would reply by saying that he attended La Universidad del Hambre, the University of Hunger. And the professor was astounded to know that he had not attended college. All this came from his experience working in Stamen. So this was a common theme in our research project. The workers learned so many skills in Stamen. And as you heard in the documentary, there was electricians, carpenters, designers, mechanics, welders, bookkeepers, and so many other occupations that they learned on the job. Ms. Villaseñor remembered how her entire family would pick the leftover pecans in what we call la pepena. And her children would get out of school and the whole family would pick as much as they could. They were paid by weight, so the more buckets they could get, the more money for the family. And she described it as a procession. She said, oh, you saw all these families in a procession with all their kids going to pick la pepena. And she laughed, she called it a peregrinación. All of the participants shared that they were very proud to live and work in Stamen, and that it had helped their children immensely. Doris Bevel said it best. We bragged about how we lived in the 4,700 acres of pecan orchards, the largest orchard in the world. It was a very big sense of pride to say that we lived in Stamen Farms. When I think about the legacy of Stamen Farms, I think of the generation of people that were impacted from the hard work, the joy, and the sense of community fostered by the people who worked and lived here. Listening to the stories, many of the descendants of the workers of Stamen have gone on to become successful in many facets of life, personally, academically, professionally. And I can still feel the pride when people share that they grew up or worked in Stamen. I myself am very proud to be from Stamen. In conclusion, my hope is that next time when you take a drive on Highway 28 and drive through Stamen Farms, you look beyond the beauty of the trees and you think of the hardworking people who worked and are still working there, and of the families who flourished in this beautiful place. When you drive through there again, remember their fascinating stories and their lasting legacy. Thank you.